Suppose that a $10 per unit subsidy is paid to suppliers of widgets. The effect will be what? So let's draw a $10 per unit subsidy. We don't know whether demand and supply is inelastic or elastic, so we'll just draw them like that, somewhere in the middle. Label our equilibrium, and now it's time to shift supply. So if we've got a subsidy paid to suppliers, that means it's supply that's going to shift, and if they're getting paid to do it, that's going to make them want to do more. So supply is going to increase like this. Specifically, the distance here would be $10 because that's the amount of the subsidy. This quantity here is how much would be produced with a subsidy. And from the way I drew it in the notes, we've got these two different prices because the difference between what price consumers pay and producers get is very different. So this top one has the price that producers actually get to keep. It's on the supply curve here and only supply curve. Whereas down here, this is the price that consumers actually pay. Also, because the subsidy is going direct to the suppliers instead of the consumers, this would be our observed market price. So that's how much they would actually pay at the register, and then the government would send a check for the rest of the $10 for each of the widgets purchased. So let's see our options. Our first one says the observed market price paid by consumers will fall. And we see price go from P0 down here, so that is indeed true. The second one says the production of widgets will fall because the price falls. Well, we saw that our production goes up, so that's not true. Then C says the consumption of widgets will rise, which is also true. So our option here is both A and C. Suppose instead that there's a $10 per unit subsidy paid to consumers of Lupits. As a result, what will happen? So if we draw our market for Lupits, again, we know nothing about the demand and the supply, so we'll just draw them like that and sketch out our equilibrium. Okay, now this subsidy is going to consumers, so it's demand that's going to increase. So our demand increases. Let's try that again. Now it's a little more parallel. So demand with the subsidy increases like this. Again, this vertical difference here is the $10 between the two. So that's the difference from the demand curve and the supply curve at any point. It's parallel shift. This is our new equilibrium. And the equilibrium price has two different places again. Again, that's based on first the intersection here to get the quantity, and then when we go down, we happen to pass through another curve. So to figure out which is which, this dot is on the demand curve, so that must be the consumer price. This dot is on the original supply curve, so this is the producer. Notice, just like in their picture in the first question, the producer price is higher than the consumer price. It's going to be the case for a subsidy no matter who the subsidy is placed on. What will be different is what we talk about as the observed market price. So the market price again is where both of our things, or both of our curves exist. So that's going to be this price up here. So this is our market price in this case. Because the subsidy is given directly to the consumers pay more at the register for the good than they did otherwise, whereas before it was the producers getting the money later from the government. So this means now our observed market price has risen. So it has not fallen, it has risen. And consumption rises as well. So our answer here is just B. Curly is one of many of thousands of sellers of rhubarb juice in America. As a result, the demand curve for Curly's rhubarb juice is perfectly elastic. The federal government makes Curly, and only Curly, pay a $1 per gallon tax on every gallon of rhubarb juice he sells. What will be the result? So when we draw our picture, we now know that the demand for Curly's rhubarb juice is perfectly elastic. That means it's shaped like this. We don't know what a supply curve looks like, but we'll draw it upward sloping like that. And this here is the price for the juice and the quantity purchased. Now with this $1 per gallon tax, that's going to increase his marginal cost or decrease the supply by $1, right? This height here is $1. And we see the new equilibrium quantity will indeed be lower, as it is with a tax, but the price is actually the same. And that's because demand is perfectly elastic. If he tried to pass off even a penny of that tax to the buyers of his rhubarb juice, nobody would buy it at all. So he cannot change the price of his juice whatsoever. So A says Curly will raise the price he charges by $1 per gallon in order to keep his profits up. He might like to do that, but he can't. He'll lose every single customer if he does. B says Curly will be unable to raise the price at all if he wants to continue selling the juice. That's true. That's what our curve shows us because demand is perfectly elastic for Curly. If Curly raises his price by a moderate amount, say 50 cents or less, he will be able to keep most of his customers. That is again not true. Even a penny is too much in this case. So our answer here is B. In the notes, I draw what happens when there is a tax on producers as well as a subsidy on consumers. I wanted to show you the alternative of both of these. There's a bit of a sketch when at the end talking about who the most elastic one is, but I wanted to sort of complete those for you. So again, I know the elasticity matters, so I'm drawing them roughly elastic, unit elastic to be exact. And here's our starting point. So if we're going to tax consumers, that means the demand is going to decrease by the amount of the tax. So we'll say this is our new demand curve, where it intersects supply, gives us our quantity after the tax. We'll have to trace that line up so that we get both prices here. And this top dot is only on the demand curve, so that's the consumer price, and this is the producer price. But in case it matters, where both curves are, which is that bottom dot, is also the market price. So that's what we would observe, what would be labeled for the price of whatever this item is. So let's look at what happens to some key items. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, tax revenue, total expenditures, total revenue, because they're not the same thing anymore, and welfare. So this is welfare to society as a whole. So consumer surplus after the tax is essentially this top triangle. You also could have drawn the one that goes to the red line, but our picture will lay out nicer if we do this one. So there's our new consumer surplus. It used to go all the way down to P0, but doesn't anymore. So it used to go all the way down here, but now it doesn't. And so consumer surplus is lower than before. Producer surplus stops at the price that producers actually receive and goes all the way to their cost. So producer surplus is lower as well. Make that black, it's a little hard to see. Okay, tax revenue. The government is getting the difference between the price consumers pay and the price producers get. And so this rectangle here is our tax revenue. So I'll just label that it's in purple. Just like before, if you wanted to calculate it, it's the difference between the consumer price and the producer price times the quantity after the tax. It's important to use the quantity after the tax, not the one before, because things change once you put the tax in. I'm sorry, I labeled the wrong thing, that. So this is, there we go. And then total surplus, since producer and consumer surplus have gone down, total surplus is going down as well. The last thing we haven't colored in is this little triangle here, which we've been calling deadweight loss. And so because of that deadweight loss, welfare has gone down. Not because total surplus went down, but because we're underproducing this thing now. Total expenditures and total revenue are going to be a little bit harder to find now because they are indeed different. So for total expenditures, that is price consumers pay times the quantity they purchase. We can see here that consumers are paying a higher price, so the price is going up and the quantity is falling. And so because I haven't told you on this specific one what the elasticity is, we don't know for sure, so the answer to this depends on the elasticity of demand. Total revenue, though, we will be able to tell. So revenue is how much money is made. So that's the price the producer gets to keep times the quantity they sell. Here our producer price is lower than it used to be, and so is the quantity. So we can tell for sure that total revenue has fallen. So this gives you a picture of what happens whenever there is a tax on consumers. And so lastly, we'll talk about what happens when there's a subsidy to producers. So this means the government is paying producers to do something, so their marginal cost of producing falls, so the supply is going to increase. So drawing out our picture, again, I'm just going to draw roughly unit elastic for my demand and supply, just to keep things from looking too wonky. So there's my starting point. If we've got a subsidy and an increase in supply, that means it is shifting out like this, right? That's an increase. And this vertical difference between the two is the amount of the subsidy. So here's our quantity produced and purchased. Trace that up to get the other one. And again, we have 2 points. With the case of a subsidy, producers get more money than consumers have to pay, which is why this top dot is only on the supply curve. So this is the producer price, while this is the consumer price down there. So that gives you a picture of what things look like. So when it comes to drawing our consumer and producer surplus, things are going to be a little hard to see. So I'm not going to color them in this time because there's going to be too many lines. So the consumer surplus goes all the way down there. So our consumer surplus is higher. Our producer surplus now goes to that higher producer price. And so producer surplus is also higher. The yellow's hard to see, so I'll just underline it. Okay. So together, since both of those are writing, total surplus, or total gains from trade, as we also call this, is going up. Okay. Then we need to look at our subsidy amount. So how much money is this subsidy going to cost? Well, it's the number of units times the per subsidy amount, or per unit subsidy amount, which is the difference between the price the producers get and the price consumers pay. Or if it tells you how much the subsidy amount is, you can just use that. And then you also need to be sure to multiply it times the subsidy amount, because having the subsidy is going to make the amount purchased increased for sure. Okay, we've got that. And what's next? Oh, we should talk about total expenditures and total revenue again. So total expenditures is the price that spending, consumers are the one doing the spending, so it is the consumer price times the quantity. And here our consumer price fell from P0 to P-con, and our quantity rose. And so again, it's going to depend on the elasticity of demand. Because the elasticity of demand will tell us whether that Q changed more than P because it's elastic, or less than P because it's inelastic. For total revenue, however, we'll be able to figure it out. Total revenue is how much money the company makes. So it's the price they get times the quantity they sell. Here, our producer price went from P0 to P prod, so it's gone up. Our quantity has gone up as well. And so total revenue has risen. Our last thing to talk about is welfare to society as a whole. Things are looking pretty good in this market, right? Consumers are happy, producers are happy, so everybody in the market is happy. However, there's still a deadweight loss. So all of these units are really costing up here, even though they only benefit people down there. So this triangle in between the two gives us a deadweight loss. So welfare goes down because of this deadweight loss. It's making too many things be produced in this subsidized market according to what our actual costs and benefits say should be produced. One more thing to add that I forgot when we were talking about is which one of these would be the market price. Well, because between these two red dots, this top one only has one line, this bottom one has a demand and a supply, so this would be the observed market price. Since the subsidy is going to producers, the producers would accept a lower price from consumers, knowing that they would get more money from the government at some other point.